to the next section of our Gender in the Law course, Module 2. This short video is an introduction to feminisms, including a very cursory history of the growth of feminism in Western culture. Basically, in early philosophies, for example, Greek philosophy, there was a very strong view of women as lesser. If you read theorists such as Aristotle, he actually refers to women as an incomplete man or a mutilated man, and theorizes that women are substantially less capable intellectually and otherwise than men. They also had very strong views around private and public spheres, in that men were responsible for decisions in the public sphere. Women were to maintain a private space and be under the rule of the head of their household, literally the patriarch. And this is where we start to see the idea of the patriarch as head of house and head of society, a term that was borrowed by later feminists to describe a system of society that privileges the interests of certain types of men and empowers men at the expense of women, which we call the patriarchy. Very early liberal theorists started out having a similar approach, and John Stuart Mill, who himself wrote some early proto-feminist work, did think in his work on the liberty of the individual and the early so-called liberal theory that there was a sphere of privacy in the home outside of the scope of state regulation, and that there should be only regulation as necessary to protect rights outside of that private sphere. He was very much part of the idea that an Englishman's home was his castle. And I do use the word Englishman here advisedly, because at that time in law, the man was literally the head and law of the household. Women did not, as you would have seen in our introductory module, have a separate legal existence once they were married under the law of coverture. So where did this leave women? Effectively, up until the mid and Victorian times, in most Western countries, women were second-class citizens. And the feminist movement was in part a response to that and an outgrowth of the incredibly difficult work done to secure property rights and franchise rights for women. There were early theorists starting to think about the position of women from the 1700s. Mary Wollstonecraft is often credited as being one of the first English language proto-feminist writers. Wollstonecraft, the name probably seems familiar. She was the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, but this is a generation before. Mary Wollstonecraft was an intellectual who had come from an upper class family, but that had become impoverished. She blazed her own way very much and had an interesting life between England and France. Ran political salons, wrote a number of books, and one of her very important pieces of writing, following up on a piece she wrote called A Vindication of the Rights of Man, was a piece called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And in that she argued that girls and women should have the same access to education that men did, so that that could then fit them with the ability to have the same access to various types of occupations, though she did still restrict this somewhat by class. At the time, in the 1700s, this was considered shockingly radical. And others started to pick up these ideas. Another famous writer in the mid-1800s was Harriet Taylor Mill. She was actually the wife of John Stuart Mill, and she wrote the famous essay, The Enfranchisement of Women, in 1851, writing in a carefully written and reasoned plea for women to have the vote. I've actually also provided a short video that quotes from some of that if you're interested. This was followed up, unfortunately, after Harriet Taylor Mill's death by a piece written by and originally only attributed to John Stuart Mill. However, he himself stated that many of the ideas were those of Harriet Taylor Mill and that parts of the work were written by their daughter, Helen Taylor. And that was on the subjection of women. And what they were looking at here was for women to be full subjects of their society. That is, he was arguing, and based on ideas which he had developed with his wife and daughter, that women should have the same access to education, suffrage, occupations, etc., and that without knowing what women were capable of, to restrict them from doing things effectively was to argue that they couldn't do it, but they must be restricted from it, and that therefore men suspected women could do a whole range of things they were being stopped from doing, and that in a just society women would have the chance to demonstrate what they were capable of doing. This type of writing informed the suffrage movement, which I mentioned when I looked at votes in the introduction and overview of Australian legal history in Module 1. And the suffrage movement was very much part of the so-called first wave of Western feminism. That wave started to consider issues around not only suffrage, that is voting rights, but also more social rights. Virginia Woolf wrote the seminal collection of essays, A Room of One's Own, in 1929. It's technically one essay, but it has a range of different pieces. And in it, she was arguing that while women were treated as second-class citizens, they would not have the same ability to demonstrate their abilities and to influence society. That a writer such as herself needed literally a room of her own, something very few, even upper and middle class women such as herself would have. That is one that she could use for her intellectual endeavours, locking others out. This, of course, has been critiqued by other writers such as Alice Walker, who has pointed out that famous women of colour in the US who wrote important, detailed intellectual essays as slaves and as newly freed women themselves not only didn't have a room, but literally did not own themselves. But Woolf's point was that women in a family should not be treated as lesser than the sons of the family, who would often have better educations and better rooms. She used an extended metaphor, one that's been picked up and discussed in feminism, of Shakespeare's sister, discussing how Shakespeare's sister would have been prevented from education, from developing her abilities, forced into marriage, etc. So, whereas Shakespeare was encouraged and helped to develop his abilities. And she talks of the silencing of the many, many women, the Shakespeare sisters, who throughout history were treated as housekeepers and servants of their families rather than as intellectual luminaries themselves. Coming into further into the 20th century, we start to see the early development of our current theorisation around gender with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, in which she makes an impassioned description of the position of women in society, stating that our ideas of femininity are, in the more modern terms, socially constructed, and saying one was not born a woman, one becomes one, because one is effectively trained in what femininity and womanhood require, and that often leads to women being placed as less than men. So this is only a sample. There are many, many more writers across many continents during this time. And unfortunately, originally many of them were seen as mere adjuncts. So Mary Wollstonecraft's work was often seen as less than due to her interesting personal life. And she was discredited for having slept with a man out and born a child outside of marriage earlier in her life, before marrying Wollstonecraft Shelley's father. Matters that really reinforced the types of arguments made by these women that, again, their intellectual contributions were being overlooked because of their status as women. So that was our first wave of feminism, which led to battles for things such as the vote, for married women to own their own property, for women to be allowed to work outside the home, etc. Coming into the mid-20th century, around the time of Simone de Beauvoir, we see a second wave of feminism developing that through the 60s and 70s saw massive changes in society with the work of liberal feminists and radical feminists, leading to such things as our own Sex Discrimination Act. Throughout the 70s, there was also the development based on postmodern philosophy, such as the work of Lacan and Foucault in France, that led to postmodern forms of feminism, such as Butler's early work, and an important strand of pro-woman intellectual inquiry known as womanism, which rejected this simplicity and the assumptions of white Western feminism to include the concerns of women of colour, and to develop further lines of thinking, of critique and of protest around the concerns of those women, which are often ignored by many of the white women who dominated feminism and sometimes argued that women of colour should take a back seat so that white women's concerns would be heard first. That led throughout the 80s and 90s and even today to the growth of what we now call intersectional feminisms, which are the subject of Module 3. That is feminisms which include ideas around multiple oppressions, that include ideas around critical race theory, queerness, colonialism, and a range of other intersecting oppressions, and how they interweave with issues of gender in feminism. This led into and is part of our third wave of feminism, which was more sex positive generally than the second wave, which was critical about heterosexual sexual norms in a society in which women were oppressed both financially and socially. Third wave feminism, in addition to being more intersectional and more sex positive, often embraced ideas from a range of the types of threads of feminism that we look at in the other videos for this week. There's even talk now that this has morphed into a fourth wave of feminism with the Me Too movement and the increasing awareness of types of social power around capitalism, improper sexual behaviours, and more modern critiques of some of the outcomes of third wave feminism. And part of that are things such as cyberfeminism and xenofeminism, which again are discussed in other videos. Some of the intersectional feminisms that I mentioned include things such as lesbian and separatist feminism, the idea that women should eschew contact with men to actually have a position in sometimes their own separate societies, which would allow for a rejection of patriarchy. Trans feminisms, that is feminisms that include the concerns of transgender people. Post-colonial feminisms, considering the impact of the colonial period and how that has affected so many people around the world, and in particular in the global south. Womanism, as I've mentioned, an outgrowth of borrowing on ideas of feminism, but situating the concerns of women of colour as a primary concern of their movement. Global South feminisms, which are an outgrowth again of post-colonial feminism, and these two often have quite a lot of overlaps, but again there are differing concerns at different times. And of course Islamic feminisms, something which is often overlooked in the West, and which are strong and vital intellectual traditions that, as I say, are often overlooked. As you'll see from the other videos this week, there are many streams of feminism, or many feminisms, but they do share some commonalities. Most feminist theory agrees that most societies, and particularly modern Western society, are based on patriarchal power. That is power based on the inherent superiority of men and the inherent right to men of power, and that power in those societies mirrors the interests of men and promotes the interests of men, often at the expense of women. That does not mean, however, as many of the feminisms would clearly acknowledge, that every man benefits from patriarchy. Patriarchy and men are not exactly cognate terms. The patriarchy is a system of power which privileges the interests of men and which empowers men often at the expense of women. But that does not mean that every man is empowered or that every man has power over every woman, something that is particularly explored in many intersectional feminisms. Most feminist theories would also agree that patriarchies generally wrongly treat women as inferior to men, that women are not in fact inferior to men. Most will critique and fight patriarchy and attempt to create equal rights and social standing for women, even if they disagree on the details of their theoretical basis or on the ways to gain equal rights and social standing for women. And as the famous quote says, that came from Mary Shear in New Directions for Women, feminism is the radical notion that women are people. So, and all feminisms would pretty much agree with that. What she was meaning there was that if you take a neutral person and endow them with rights, women also should have those rights and should be treated with the same levels of respect, autonomy, etc., as are connoted in the term person, something which, as we saw in our introduction, women had been literally and legally excluded from in some Western societies, including our own. We also look at feminist jurisprudence. Generally, feminist jurisprudence is the application of feminist theory and critique to law. Jurisprudence is the theory of law, or the philosophy of law. And feminist jurisprudence is a feminist theory of law. Why do we look at feminist jurisprudence? Because there is a long history of critique of law as being an enabler or promoter of patriarchy, in that it often is shaped around a normative male figure as the person of law, that normative masculinity of law is often at the expense of women and at the empowerment of men. But again, not all men and not all the time. As Anna Greer said, the patriarchy is the DNA of our legal system. And so feminist jurisprudence critiques that and seeks to make changes to and about law that mirror the feminist objectives of different feminist movements.